And we're continuing with The Mystery of Marie Rogêt by Edgar Allan Poe. So Dupin has now put it out there that the idea that Marie was attacked by a gang of people was only because there was another article written about a gang attacking a girl by the same river that she was found in, and that the spot where her clothes were found, there was really no way to determine the time because they were all gathered up and taken by this kid. He makes a lot of fun of the fact that they use the word mildew so many times, even though it's very easy for things to get mildewed from just sitting out for a short period of time. And we'll continue from there. Thus we see at a glance that what has been most triumphantly adduced in support of the idea that the articles had been for at least 3 or 4 weeks in the thicket is most absurdly null as regards to any evidence of that fact. On the other hand, it is exceedingly difficult to believe that these articles could have remained in the thicket specified for a longer period than a single week, for a longer period than from one Saturday to the next. Those who know anything of the vicinity of Paris know the extreme difficulty of finding seclusion, unless at a great distance from its suburbs. Such a thing as an unexplored or even an unfrequently visited recess amid the woods or groves is not for a moment to be imagined. Let anyone who, being at heart a lover of nature, is yet chained by duty to the dust and heat of this great metropolis, let any such one attempt, even during the weekdays, to slake his thirst for solitude amid the scenes of natural loveliness which immediately surround us. At every second step he will find the growing charm dispelled by the voice and personal intrusion of some ruffian or party of carousing blackguards. He will seek privacy amid the densest foliage, all in vain. Here are the very nooks where the unwashed most abound. Here are the temples most discreet, most desperate. With sickness of the heart, the wanderer will flee back to the polluted Paris as to a less odious because less incongruous stink of pollution. But if the vicinity of the city is so beset during the working days of the week, how much more so on the Sabbath? It is now especially that released from the chains of labor or deprived of the customary opportunities of crime, the town blackguards seek the precincts of the town, not through the love of the rural, which in his heart he despises, but by way of escape from the restraints and conventionalities of society. He desires less the fresh air and the green trees than the utter license of the country. Here, at the roadside inn, or beneath the foliage of the woods, he indulges, unchecked by any eye except those of his boon companions, in all the mad excesses of a counterfeit hilarity, the joint offices of liberty, spring, of liberty and rum. I say nothing more than what must be obvious to every dispassionate observer when I repeat that the circumstance of the articles in question have remained undiscovered for a longer period than from one Sunday to another in any thicket in the immediate neighborhood of Paris is to be looked upon as a little less than miraculous. But there are not wanting other grounds for the suspicion that the articles were placed in the thicket with the view of diverting attention from the real scene of the outrage. And first, let me direct your notice to the date of the discovery of the articles. Collate this with the date of the 5th extract made by myself from the newspapers. You will find that the discovery followed almost immediately the urgent communications sent to the evening paper. These communications, although various and apparently from various sources, tended all to the same point, viz., the directing of attention to a gang as the perpetrators of the outrage, and to the neighborhood of the Barrière des Roues as its scene. Now here, of course, the suspicion is not that, in consequence of these communications, or of the public attention by them directed, the articles were found by the boys, but the suspicion might but the suspicion might and may well have been that the articles were not before found by the boys, for the reason that the articles had not before been in the thicket, having been deposited there only at so late a period as at the date or shortly prior to the date of the communications by the guilty authors of the communications themselves. The thicket was a singular and exceedingly singular one. Unusually dense, within its naturally walled enclosure there were 3 extraordinary stones, forming a seat with a back and footstool, and this thicket, so full of natural art, was in the immediate vicinity, within a few rods of the dwelling of Madame Dulac, whose boys were in the habit of closely examining the shrubberies about them in search of the bark of the sassafras. Would it be a rash wager, a wager of 1,000 to 1, that a day never passed over the heads of these boys without finding at least one of them ensconced in the ambergris hall and enthroned upon its natural throne? Those who would hesitate at such a wager have either never been boys themselves, or have forgotten the boyish nature. I repeat, it is exceedingly hard to comprehend how the articles could have remained in this thicket undiscovered for a longer period than 1 or 2 days, and that thus there is good ground for suspicion, in spite of the dogmatic ignorance of Le Soleil, that they were, at a comparatively late date, deposited where found. But there are still other and stronger reasons for believing them so deposited than any which I have yet urged. And now let me bring your notice to the highly artificial arrangement of the articles. On the upper stone lay a white petticoat, on the second a silk scarf. Scattered around were a parasol, gloves, and a pocket handkerchief bearing the name Marie Rogêt. Here is just such an arrangement as would naturally be made by a not over-acute person wishing to dispose of the articles naturally. But it is by no means a really natural arrangement. I should rather have looked to see the things all lying on the ground and trampled underfoot in the narrow limits of that bower. It would have been scarcely possible that the petticoat and scarf should have retained a position upon the stones, when subjected to the brushing to and fro of many struggling persons. There was evidence, it is said, of a struggle, and the earth was trampled, the bushes were broken, but the petticoat and the scarf are found deposited as if upon shelves. The prices of the frock torn out by the bushes were about 3 inches wide and 6 inches long, one part of the hem of a frock, and it had been mended. They looked like strips torn off. Here, inadvertently, Le Soleil has employed an exceedingly suspicious phrase. The pieces as described do indeed look like strips torn off, but purposely and by hand. It is one of the rarest of accidents that a piece is torn off from any garment, such as is now in question, by the agency of a thorn. From the very nature of such fabrics, a thorn or a nail becoming entangled in them tears them rectangularly, divides them into longitudinal rents at right angles at each other, and meeting at an apex where the thorn enters. But it is scarcely possible to conceive the piece torn off. I never knew it, nor did you. To tear a piece off from such fabric, 2 distinct forces in different directions, will be in almost every case required, if there be 2 edges in the fabric. If, for example, it be a pocket handkerchief, and it is desired to tear it from a slip, then and only then will the one force serve the purpose. But in the present case the question is of a dress, presenting but one edge. To tear a piece from the interior where no edge is presented could only be effected by a miracle through the agency of thorns, and no one thorn could accomplish it. But even where an edge is presented, 2 thorns will be necessary, operating the one in 2 distinct directions, and the other in one. And this is the supposition that the edge is unhemmed. If hemmed, the matter is nearly out of the question. We thus see the numerous and great obstacles in the way of pieces being torn off, through the simple agency of thorns. Yet we are required to believe not only that one piece, but that many have been so torn, and one part too was the hem of the frock. Another piece was part of the skirt, not the hem. That is to say, was torn completely out, through the agency of thorns, from the unedged interior of the dress. These, I say, are things which one may well be pardoned for disbelieving, yet, taken collectively, they form perhaps less of reasonable grounds for suspicion than the one startling circumstance of the articles having been left in the thicket at all, by any murderers who had enough precaution to think of removing the corpse. You will not have apprehended me rightly, however, if you suppose it my design to deny this thicket at the scene of the outrage. There might have been a wrong here, or more possibly an accident at Madame Dulac's, but in fact this is a point of minor importance. We are not engaged in an attempt to discover the scene, but to produce the perpetrators of the murder. What I have adduced, notwithstanding the minuteness with which I have adduced it, has been with the view first to show the folly of the positive and the headlong assertions of Le Soleil, but secondly, and chiefly, to bring you, by the most natural route, to a further contemplation of the doubt whether this assassination has or has not been the work of a gang. We will resume the question by mere allusion to the revolting details of the surgeon examined at the inquest. It is only necessity to say that his published interferences in regard to the number of the ruffians have been properly ridiculed as unjust and totally baseless by all the reputable anatomists of Paris. Not that the matter might not have been inferred, but that there was no ground for the interference. Was there not much for another? Let us reflect upon the traces of a struggle, and let me ask what these traces have been supposed to demonstrate. A gang. But do they not rather demonstrate the absence of a gang? What struggle could have taken place? What struggle so violent and so enduring as to have left traces in all directions between a weak and defenseless girl and a gang of ruffians imagined, and the gang of ruffians imagined? The silent grasp of a few rough arms, and all would have been over. The victim must have been absolutely passive at their will. You will here bear in mind that the arguments urged against the thicket at the scene are applicable in chief part only against it at the scene of an outrage committed by more than a single individual. If we imagine but one violator, we can conceive, and thus only conceive, the struggle of so violent and so obstinate a nature as to have left the traces apparent. And there we will pause.